What happens when one man tries to watch all of the sci-fi films of the 1980s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 80s Project. Well, this is it. This is the end of 1982 when it comes to sci-fi and fantasy and superheroes and I don't know, whatever else I plan to throw in here, since this side series tends to be a catch-all for whatever I want to cover that's not horror. So, if you watch one of these and say, how's that sci-fi? Just know that the answer is, because I said so. And, well, this has been a year, right? Lots of major releases, but this last block still has some surprises coming your way. So, let's close out this year. To kick off this block, we have to backtrack a bit to one that belonged in the last episode. And on September 9th, over in Italy, we have the arrival of Gunin, King of the Barbarians, although it would also be released on VHS as the Invincible Barbarian. It begins with dinosaurs fighting. Well, it's actually just footage from 1 million years BC, and I mean, I don't mean like it's actual footage from that time period. I mean the Raquel Welch film. It then fast forwards a couple of million years, and a child is being born. And like usual, there's some sort of prophecy around it. Then, as expected, a bunch of guys on horseback show up and lay waste to the village, including some people who look like they have no idea how to pretend to use a sword. Twins are born just before their mother is killed, but the babies are saved and taken to safety. They grow to adulthood, but it's said that the prophecy stated that there would be only one child, and it said that the twins share a single spirit. They're not named, and one of the brothers is anxious to claim the name of Zukon, but he'll instead have to challenge his brother to be the true Invincible Barbarian. They brawl, with the red-headed twin winning and taking the name of Zukon and getting a sword prize. But, bad guy Nuriak is still searching for the children and causing some troubles. And this was an Italian film from Francesco Prosperi and was one of his very last films. He had been directing various low-budget flicks since the 60s, and we had covered him previously a bit since he co-directed White Cannibal Queen with Jess Franco. After this film, he did one more, another sword and sorcery flick called Throne of Fire, that we'll cover in the 83 Sci-Fi Project, and then he retired. And hey, speaking of White Cannibal Queen, the queen herself, Sabrina Ciani, appears in this film as well. And given that this came out slightly before Ator, this film actually has the distinction of being the first of the Italian Conan ripoffs. But as we'll see shortly, absolutely not the last. And this is a 2 for me. Not a strong start to this block, but it's just so boring. But the wigs alone are entertaining enough for the extra star. Its significance is just a 1 since it's pretty lost to time, and its only merit is as a Conan clone. Should you watch it? Likely not. Stick to the real deal.
That's it, now hug him.
We're at the ending of October now with a film that's released on the 21st in the UK, and it's the animated nightmare The Plague Dogs. And if you don't like animals in peril, you may want to skip ahead. It begins with a dog in a test where it's being drowned and revived. And then there's this guy who didn't make it. That night, a cage is left unlatched, and there's Ralph, and he's the one they almost drowned. And Snitter, who has this bandage on his head because they're likely doing experiments on him, and they figure out that the door is open. They refer to the humans as the white coats, the doctors who work there, and geez, there's monkeys and rabbits all being tested on, and they take refuge in the incinerator, which is full of the remnants of discarded ash of previous experiments, and oh my god, how dark is this gonna get? They almost get fried, but escape into the wild, and they have a series of encounters with humans that live nearby. And I should mention that Snitter is voiced by John Hurt himself. They eventually meet up with a fox called the Todd, and he teaches them a bit about living on their own, and even accidentally shoot a man in the face with his own gun. People from the town and the Whitecoats are looking for the dogs based on the information that the tests that they were doing involved the bubonic plague. And you may be saying to yourself, what is this cartoon? This makes Watership Down look like Paw Patrol. And it's actually directed and written by the man responsible for Watership Down, Martin Rosen. And like that film, this was also adapted from a novel, this one from 1977 by Richard Adams. It featured the return of a number of animators and behind-the-scenes crew from Watership, and a good portion of the voice crew, although one voice that's new to this one is Patrick Stewart in his first animated voice work. Another early famous player here was a very young Brad Bird, who was an animator, but he was fired by Rosen at some point during the filming. He'd bounce back, though, and would later be a big deal with directing The Iron Giant and The Incredibles. It was unique at the time, as it was considered more violent than other animated films, even though this was an era of exploring darker themes in cartoon features, but it would end up being released in the US in an unrated fashion, although that wouldn't happen until late in 1983 in a limited run, and then not until '85 for a full release. Later on home release, it would get a rating though, a PG-13. Rosen said that the release was really disappointing, and at a premiere screening it upset a woman enough to hit him with her umbrella. Later, in the US, he would go to showings and ask people what they thought of it, for them to consistently tell him how depressing it was. It lost money both in the UK and US, even if the reviews were quite kind. Its poor performance caused the distributor to pull it from theaters early and didn't give it much of a home run to cut its losses. Since then, though, it's become a bit of a cult film, particularly as a statement about animal abuse and testing, and was even sampled quite a bit in Skinny Puppy's Testure. Meanwhile, if you've seen it and can't get over how downbeat the ending is, I recommend the book, which has a considerably more cheerful finale. And guys, this is hard to watch, but powerful. It's a 4 from me. Just sheer darkness and beauty all in one film. Its sci-fi cultural significance is a 2 though, since it's clearly not as spoken about as its rabbit-themed brother, but had some power behind it. Should you watch it? Yes, but just be prepared to cry a bit.
Just stay with me. I'll get you there.
And then, on the entire opposite side of the emotional spectrum, and also even further away from the United States, on November 1st, there was a little ditty called Dunyani Kurtaran Adam, or the man who saves the world. Or, I suppose, Turkish Star Wars. A voiceover tells us that in the far future, the world became unstable due to nuclear war, and they went off to find new planets. And, this footage they're showing looks a little familiar. I wonder where I've seen that before. There's a space battle with TIE fighters and X-Wings and this music? And also this music. The two Earth heroes, Marat and Ali, crash land on another planet, and geez, the Planet of the Apes music? They fight some skeleton guys again with all Indiana Jones music and Flash Gordon, and come up against the evil sorcerer. He's trying to destroy Earth and can't do it because it has a shield that is made of concentrated human brain molecules and needs a human brain to get past it. But then there's like Yeti mummies that get beheaded, and this fuzzy buddy who kills a bunch of kids. And what am I even watching? What is this? I mean, even the sound effects are all recycled. And you may once again be saying to yourself, what the hell am I looking at here? Well, it's a Turkish film and was made to be a sort of original concept, but a lot of the details are lost to time. But you know what's not lost to time, though? those awesome cantina aliens that are even more clearly guys in masks than the original Star Wars. Apparently, there was a rough cut of the film that ran about 2.5 hours long, but the film's studio thought that that was way too long, considering that the average length of Turkish films at this time were less than an hour and a half. So they chopped it down to around an hour and 40, losing a lot of the plot and explaining why this film just seems to jump from thing to thing with no explanation. It's also been said that it wasn't originally meant to have so much Star Wars footage spliced in. They had built a bunch of spaceship sets on a Turkish beach, and a big storm wiped them out. The studio was unwilling to fork up the money for new ones, so the filmmakers just stole a print of Star Wars and edited out what they needed. Due to all the incorporated audio and video, it never received any sort of American run. It went on to become internationally notorious for being one of the worst movies ever made, and took on the name Turkish Star Wars on bootleg copies, and then became an underground sensation. It became enough of a thing that they made a sequel in 2006, although it failed to make the same mark, mainly because it skipped the whole IP thievery aspect. And this is fairly fun. I give it a 3. It's silly stuff, although it gets monotonous after a while. But the audacity of just recycling music clip after music clip is hysterical. Its significance is pretty low at a 1.5 since it's virtually unknown here, and the 0.5 is for the cult notice that it's achieved. Should you watch it? I think so. It's definitely one of the weirder watches you'll have. A few weeks later, on November 17th, we're still not in the US because we're in Italy here for the release of 1990, The Bronx Warriors. It begins with a woman on the run in New York City and some powerful men looking for her, and we learn that the Bronx is now considered a no man's land that the police have given up on, and it's currently occupied by various gangs wearing outlandish themed outfits. And one of them is this cycle group called the Riders. Their leader is this hunky hunk named Trash, and they take Anne in, and a while later, one of the Riders is killed. They go to the scene where this dude is just chilling and playing drums, and I guess this dude was just someone that was in the area practicing, and they just asked him to be in the movie, so he's there, because why not? And I think Trash, I swear to God that this man is constantly walking while holding in a fart. It's like he's being told over and over, chest out, shoulders back, left foot, right foot. Their rival gang is the Tigers, and they're run by an inglorious bastard. But those corporate jerks want Anne back, so they send in Jennifer Jason Leigh's dad to hunt her down. And if you haven't guessed it by now, this is essentially a riff on a couple of movies. It's one part Road Warrior, one part Escape from New York, and one part The Warriors, and was directed by a man who knows his ripoffs, and it's Enzo Castellari, director of The Last Shark, a blatant Jaws ripoff. But he's also been ripped off himself, since he directed the action film The Inglourious Basterds, a film with a title so cool that it was blatantly stolen with one letter changed to make it unique, I guess. The idea arose from producer Fabrizio De Angelis, and he was in New York and accidentally ended up in the Bronx, had an encounter with a street gang, and made this whole film about it. In casting Anne, they didn't have to go far since she was played by Castellari's own daughter, and she'd only appear in a couple of other films after this, and then began a pretty lengthy career behind the camera as either an assistant director or director. For Trash, they cast Mark Gregory, who was only 17 when they cast him, and got the role as his fiancée sent his headshot in without him knowing it, and they called him for the part. It was his first lead role and only second film, with the first one being an extra in a TV movie, and he'd do a handful of action films after this, but grew disillusioned with the film industry and quit in '89. At some point around there, he was the victim of a scam that left him broke and homeless. He ended up living the life of a recluse, and eventually took his own life through an overdose in 2013. and didn't have enough money for a proper burial. And hey, speaking of depressing stuff, Vic Morrow's voice in the English dub had to be done by another actor because Italian films are generally all shot silently and the audio is dubbed in afterwards. And by the time that they got around to doing the English language version, Morrow had died in the accident on the set of the Twilight Zone film. The Bronx Warriors actually did pretty well, and they made a sequel right after called Escape from the Bronx that was released the following year. And I like this, but I mean it's a little dull, so I'll give it a 3. It's just a bit repetitive and takes forever to set up the whole showdown between Trash and Hammer. Its significance is a 2 since it's got a bit of cult cachet and is somewhat known but not that much and is still fairly obscure. Should you watch it? Sure. I mean, it's like watching 3 movies at once, so why not?
Hold it!
2 days later, we're back in the US finally for an arrival on November 19th. And it's the animated film, The Last Unicorn. We're in medieval times, and there's one unicorn here, and based on the title, and the fact that she says it, she's the last unicorn. And if that's not convincing enough, the opening theme song tells us too.
At the last unicorn.
The unicorn, voiced by Mia Farrow, talks to Butterfly Robert Klein, and he says that there are others out there, chased away by the Red Bull. And she decides to leave her forest and find them. Turns out that humans can't see her horn, but she's captured by a witch named Mommy Fortuna, with a voice by Angela Lansbury. And this is a little confusing, but Mommy has this sideshow and uses magic spells to make normal animals to look like mythical ones, and did the same for the unicorn, so she has 2 horns, 1 real and 1 fake magic one. Luckily, Schmendrick, her apprentice, voiced by Alan Arkin, is trying to help her out. He helps her get free, and they head off together, encountering the real-life counterpart of Robin Hood. And if you're saying, hey, this is a kid's movie, I would like to counter with the fact that Schmendrick winds up smothered within the massive breasts of a tree.
Did you see me? Were you watching? Did you see what I made?
Motorboat and a maple? Yeah, we saw ya. They also team up with Molly Grew here, and things get trickier when the Red Bull attacks and the unicorn is transformed into a human. But will she be turned back? And will they find her kind? And will she put some damn clothes on? It's also got voice work by the great Christopher Lee and Renee Auberjonois, as well as the dude himself, Jeff Bridges. And this story was adapted from the classic book by Peter S. Beagle with the same name from 1968. And he'd received several offers to adapt it over the year, and he worked with a producer named Michael Chase Walker to make it happen. But requested to not work with Rankin Bass, the animation film company that had made The Hobbit and those classic Christmas specials. However, Walker went to them anyway, because as it turned out, they were the only big-time animation studio to not say no, and the Beagle was horrified, but ended up being very happy with the finished product. The animation work was all done in Japan, and the story stuck very close to the original book, but it wasn't well received. The reviews were alright, if not spectacular, but it only grossed $6.5 million, marking it as a failure, although it did make a minor profit. It did end up with a new life on the home market, where it became a cable staple and grew a cult following, enough that talks of doing a live-action version have come and gone throughout the years, even if they've never materialized. And this one's a 3 for me. I didn't see this one when I was younger, so I don't have nostalgia for it. And I think the story's a little disjointed and aimless, but the animation is lovely. Its significance is a 2.5, since it's somewhat well known, even if it's one of the least regarded animation films of this time frame. But it has one hell of a cast list. Should you watch it? Definitely. I mean, sure, it's a kid's tale in a way, but it's a nice watch. Well, we were in America for a minute or so, but now let's go back overseas and head to Italy. But we're staying in the fantasy world on November 27th with The Sword of the Barbarians. We're told of a man named Sangral, and he's said to be the son of Ator, no relation, I assume, and he and his people are wandering, help out a small village, so they welcome them there, and their peoples merge. That doesn't last long though, because as is customary of every sword and sorcery flick, a group of marauders attack and kill everyone in sight. They're led by the evil Nantuk, who is doing this as a sort of a sacrifice for his fire goddess. But luckily, Sangral escapes, teams up with Adi and Li Wu, an archer, saying he wants to bring his wife back to life and decides to seek out a great wizard, and they get into a bunch of shenanigans on the way. And this is yet another film made in the wake of the massive success of Conan. Italy was at the forefront of this, and this arrived pretty shortly after Ator, the Fighting Eagle. It was directed by Michel and Massimo Tarantini, and most of his films were sex comedies and basic action films, but also the weird flick Massacre in Dinosaur Valley. And here's something interesting about this one. If our lead here looks familiar, that's because it's Pietro Torrisi, the same actor who played Gunin. And this film was supposedly originally made as a sequel to that film. But here's what happened. As stated, Gunin flopped and made no money, so they no longer wanted to have this one be associated with it, and wanted to create a new original property. Well, as I mentioned with the Bronx Warriors, Italian films are shot silently. The dialogue is all dubbed in later. It's cheaper and easier to do it that way, and you could just dub a bunch of different languages for different markets. The advantage here is that it's pretty easy to just change your storyline, which they did here. Instead of saying Gunin when they dubbed it, they just inserted the name Sangral instead and created an entirely new character. It's probably pretty likely that they added that line about Ator in the beginning to capitalize on that film as well, because why not? And you know what else they capitalize on? This crossbow with a capital C. And this is okay, but pretty dull, so it's a 2. There's just too much wandering around aimlessly for me. Its significance is just a 1, since it's very obscure and unspoken of, and features no major players, or minor for that matter. Should you watch it? Probably not.
He's mine to kill at last!
Next up is a movie that got a premiere on December 9th in West Germany, but also played France in '82, but didn't get an American release until 1984. And it's Slapstick of Another Kind, a movie that I swear that I covered before for something, but I can't find any trace of it, so I think it was just a nightmare. A nightmare that this movie is. It begins by telling us that China has severed all relations with all other nations, and oh, they've also figured out how to miniaturize things and people. The ambassador is Mr. Miyagi. Yeah, Pat Morita is Japanese, not Chinese, but I guess they were like, whatever, close enough. Oh, and Merv Griffin is playing Merv Griffin, and he's not even Merv Griffin, so what the hell, casting? We're told that the king of comedy is here, and he is expecting a new baby, but it's twins, and everyone keeps on talking about how incredibly ugly that they are. His wife is Lily von Stupp, and they turn the children over to the care of the hospital, who take them to a special facility, where they hire Marty Feldman's eyes for a butler. And when we finally meet the babies, well, they're also played by Lewis and Kahn, but with big head prosthetics. They have an unhealthy attachment to each other, and the president is Thurston Howell III. And here's the deal. The kids are incredibly smart, but think that people want them to be dumb, so they act really annoying at all times and stupid, but only because Sebastian has been teaching them everything wrong. But when they finally reveal their intellect, they discover that they're telepathic, but when they're separated, they lose their abilities. but together they're super smart with extra abilities. However, their closeness freaks everyone out because of the incestuous overtones. And I mean, like, they say they have to take their shirts off and touch skin to make their powers work, which is, yeah. And what the hell is this? Well, it's a sci-fi, I guess, comedy that seems to have forgotten the comedy, and was based on a book by Kurt Vonnegut called Slapstick, or Lonesome No More, a novel which the author referred to as his worst work. He wrote the initial screenplay, but it went through several rewrites, and those were done by Stephen Paul, who also directed, and it was one of only 3 films that he made, although he did a couple of religious TV shows that all seem to star Jon Voight. But his main career has been as a producer and is a pretty major player with the SPMG companies. When he tried to get this made, studios all passed, so he raised the $4 million through investors, and it was non-union. It upset Lewis, as he was unaware of this until showing up on set, but decided to finish the film anyway. It had a hard time getting distribution in the US, but did get European runs through 82 and 83, and only got a limited release in the US before it was dumped to cable. The reviews were overwhelmingly rough, and it's often shown up in lists of the worst films of all time. Gene Siskel said that the best thing that could ever happen to it is that it never be shown anywhere. And oh boy, is this one rough, but I'll give it a 2 because I like some of the satirical elements of it and the commentary on loneliness. But hey, movie, how hard did you have to work to make Madeline freaking Kahn not funny? Its significance is a 2 since it was a bomb and mostly forgotten, but did have quite a few names attached, so it has a little pull. Should you watch it? If you're curious to see something go so painfully wrong, go for it, but otherwise, stay away. Getting close to the end of the year here, and this block is heavy on adult-seeming kids' films, since on December 17th there was The Dark Crystal. The intro tells us that 1,000 years ago, a great crystal cracked and a single shard was lost, creating 2 new races. One is mean and nasty, called the Skeksis, and they took control of the castle. And the other is the opposite, the kind and gentle mystics. They've taken in a gelfling named Jin, whose family was killed by the Skeksis, and the eldest mystic is dying, and tells him that there's a prophecy that he will find the shard and heal the crystal and save the world. Meanwhile, the Skeksis Emperor is also on his last legs, and the 2 leaders die together. Although I like when the mystic dies, his hair seems to live just a little longer than he does. While there's a challenge for the Skeksis throne, Jin heads out on his quest. And along the way, he encounters the goofy Aughra. And here's a little tidbit. The voice of Aughra is Billy Whitelaw, the crossword-loving innkeeper from Hot Fuzz. He finds the shard, but then has to fight the Gartham, which are some of the coolest monster designs in all of film. And these things were terrifying back in the day. And even looking at them now, knowing that they're guys in suits, the illusion still holds up. He also meets up with another gelfling, with each thinking that they were the last of their kind. And it's Kira, who comes with a little dog named Fizzgig. Together they set off to complete the prophecy, heal the crystal, and save their world. And don't call these puppets, because technically they're Muppets, since this was from Jim Henson's studio. It was something that he had been trying to make for several years, and he wanted to get back to the dark nature of classic fairy tales, and said that he thought it was unhealthy for kids to not be afraid. Frank Oz came on board as a co-director, his first time, although he'd go on to make quite a bit more. The budget was pretty strong, with reports saying anywhere from 15 to 25 million. And when it was made, it would be the only live-action film with no human actors. An early test screening of the film didn't go over well and caused them to do a slight overhaul, and they chopped the film down by 20 minutes, and the opening narration was added to make things easier for the audience to understand. But Here's the biggest change. In the original cut, the Skeksis did not speak English. They had their own language, and there were no subtitles. It was thought that what was being portrayed was simplistic enough to understand, but the test audience disagreed, so they added in all of their dialogue in post. The reviews were pretty good, if not great, and it did fair business, bringing in around 40 million. Parents were hesitant to take their kids due to the seeming dark nature, but it really took off in the home market, quickly becoming a massive cult sensation. In 2006, there was an attempt to make a sequel, with Jendy Tartakovsky directing, based on conversations that Henson had with screenwriter David Odell. Time went by with no movement, and the Spierig brothers were then said to be handling it, but eventually the concept was scrapped, with the story instead being adapted into a comic book series. There's also been other comics and novels produced, and in 2019 there was a prequel series released on Netflix called The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance that ran for 10 episodes, but was unfortunately then canceled. And what a great story. I give this one 4.5 tapes. Like, sure, it's a bit of a mess at times story-wise, but I'm just in awe of how they were able to create this entire world and make it feel real. And you're never thinking about watching puppets. Its sci-fi cultural significance is a 4 since it's very well known, but it's not like it became this massive sensation or franchise to put it on par with its peers from the same time. Should you watch it? The prophecy says you will.
Wings. I don't have wings.
Of course not. You're a boy.
This year ends on an interesting note because it's one that I'm not sure qualifies, but yeah, I'm including it since on December 28th, closing out 1982, is Mazes and Monsters. We start with a crime scene where we're told that a game called Mazes and Monsters got out of control. A reporter describes the game, and it's very obviously not Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, their names are completely different, right? They're likely talking about Parcheesi because that game is deadly, let me tell you. Rudy is home from camp, and soap opera heartthrob David Wysocki is here too. And then there's this guy, like a little-known actor in his first major film role, and who knows, maybe he'll grow up to have sex with fish women or something. They all start college together, and I guess JJ's shtick is that he's always wearing different weird headgear. Robbie meets Kate, and they all convince him to play Mazes and Monsters with them. You see, he used to play it, but played too hard, so he doesn't want to do it anymore. But these wanton college kids peer pressure him, and he buckles to the sweet, sweet temptation of role-playing adventure. Robbie and Kate start dating, which causes them to stop playing the game, so JJ suggests upping the ante by going to the abandoned caves nearby to play the game, where Robbie starts to envision their scenario as reality and sees an actual monster. The game starts to seep into his dreams, and he starts to think it's all real. And this was a TV movie that aired on CBS and was based on a book of the same name from 1981. That was by Rona Jaffe and was based on a real news story about a college kid who disappeared for a month, and a lot of the news coverage tried to link the fact that he was an avid D&D player to his vanishing. The story of where he was has never been revealed, although it's known that he tried to kill himself multiple times and eventually succeeded a year after he reappeared. Jaffe based the book on this story and played up the D&D link, and the movie plays into that same assumption, although it's a fictionalized account of the events. It didn't make much of an impact on airing and would have fallen completely into obscurity if it were not for the subsequent success of Tom Hanks and his mega stardom, bringing it back to the surface. And I'm going with a 3 for this one. It's a nice little story with some nice moments and cute bits, but ultimately it can be a little dull. It drags on for a while, and it is a bit ridiculous considering that playing D&D only leads to having fun. Its sci-fi cultural significance is a 3, since it has become rather well known because of Tom Hanks' involvement and his first big film role, but isn't really that notable outside of that, although it's definitely formed its own cult following by this point. Should you watch it? Yeah, I think this is a game worth playing.
TJ, what am I doing here?
So there you have it. There's the ending of 1982 for sci-fi and fantasy and all the other stuff. Yeah, my favorite one of this block very clearly was The Dark Crystal. Great movie, enjoyable. There was definitely quite a bit of enjoyable stuff in this block, but also some clunkers in there too. But for the most part, this entire year has been a lot of fun and some really good flicks being released. Let me know your favorite of this year and your favorite of this block. Put it down below in the comments. I want to hear that. If you would enjoy what you see here, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines. Yeah, we'll see you in just a little bit as we start to go into 1983 for sci-fi right here on the 80s Project.